Well, friends, today we have a double header. You want to stay for the whole show. Our second half, we're going to be speaking with former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, about the deep state and the presidential election. Our returning guest for the first half of the show is joining us to talk about the morality of COVID-19 lockdowns. We're going to link to a recent video she did. I think she's a new and significant voice in alternative media. Sarah Corrier, welcome back to the Catholic Current.
Thank you for having me back. I do appreciate it. I always enjoy going on your show.
Sarah, I want to talk about the morality of the lockdowns, because this is what I've heard, and you've probably heard this too. Oh, sure, the lockdowns are inconvenient, maybe even burdensome, but if it saves just one life, ... QED, the end. That's not the showstopper for you. Why not?
Well, frankly, because it's false. Because the whole idea is based upon the fact that if we do lock down and if we go through all these different measures, that we will save lives and that we only have these two choices. That we lock down and we save lives, or we don't lock down and tons of people die. And that's false because it fails to recognize that the lockdowns themselves cause death. I mean, it's false for multiple reasons. There's also the manipulation of statistics, which maybe we'll get to in a little bit, but mostly that these lockdowns themselves are hurting people, and especially young people. The director of the CDC himself said he was particularly worried about the rising numbers of suicides and drug use. Frankly, that's materialized despair amongst young people. You can go out to the CDC website right now and look at the surveys that they've done on things like suicide ideation. Like, for example, amongst the group between the age group of 18 to 24, 25.5% have seriously considered suicide in the prior 30 days. 1/4 of the people who responded to that survey. And that's just those who admit it. I mean, most people I would imagine who are seriously considering suicide wouldn't admit it to anybody, including a surveyor. But these people did. And that's horrific. Over 24% said they had either increased or started drug abuse to try and cope with the amount of stress that is related to the virus. And by that I mean things like the lockdowns and the lack of business being open, the lack of money, and so on.
Right. Well, and then there are people who have missed doctor's appointments, who've delayed surgery, chemotherapy, etc. It's beginning to have a tremendous toll that way. But what does it say about us as human beings that there's been an increase in alcohol abuse, drug abuse, I understand domestic violence also, and then ultimately suicide, especially against the young? What does it say about us as humans that this is our response to being isolated from each other?
I think it's actually a fairly normal response, to be honest with you, because I think it is part of the human condition to yearn for companionship. It's the way that we were made. Heck, it's part of the beginning story of Adam and Eve. That loneliness, we need another, right? So I don't think it says anything particularly negative about us, but it says something about us, the fact that so many people didn't expect it. That so many people don't even seem to grasp the fundamental human nature of how we all need one another. And it says something about the fact that so many politicians have done things like left liquor stores open and closed churches because they don't think that even just the communal spirit of the church has any sort of benefit on people, that it's not essential, whereas the liquor store is. And I think that itself is something, well, that we ought to be paying attention to, because it's more than just an attack by our political class on Christians, which, by the way, is happening. Specific churches have been fined for just being open. Worshippers have been fined for showing up for drive-in church services, for example. But it's more than all of that. It's just the fact that so many people don't even see that other humans could benefit from this anymore. It's like we don't understand our own nature anymore.
Right. Friends, we're talking with social commentator Sarah Corrier. She's also known as the Crusader Gal. We're going to link to her website and a recent video she did about the morality of COVID lockdowns. Sarah, I'm very much inclined to agree with you. I mean, it shouldn't be a secret or a surprise that human beings are social. I mean, Aristotle said thousands of years ago, human beings are by nature social and political animals. As Christians, we know we're made in the image and likeness of God, who is a community of persons. It also seems to me that there was a certain elan in politicians grabbing emergency powers. And sadly, it seemed law enforcement had a certain elan in enforcing really ridiculous and draconian laws, especially against churches, while turning the blind eye to violence, etc. I know of a church vandalized not far from me, and the police said, well, we only make arrests for serious felonies because COVID. What's your analysis of the political circumstances of the United States in light of COVID?
I think we have politicians and frankly some other people in positions of power who have been waiting as like tyrants in waiting for an opportunity to seize that power and are doing so. I mean, we've all heard the phrase, right, that you can judge a person best, or you can know a person best when he gets into a position of power. There are lots of variations of that. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that a lot of people, their very worst comes out when they have that power. And the truth of the matter is that, politically speaking, the power that these people think they have, they shouldn't have. Heck, they don't have as far as the law is concerned. They're seizing powers that were never granted to them, and because so few people are willing to push back and say this is not okay, they just keep taking more and more of our rights away. Again, with powers that they're not supposed to have. And, it's so many different mini tyrants. It's the politicians that tell churches that they have to close down, that tell people they're not allowed to gather unless they're engaging in a protest that the politician in particular agrees with. It's those people, it's the police officers who are willing to arrest a person, for doing nothing, for acting as a normal human being, for not wearing a mask in some cases. I mean, to be arrested for that just seems abhorrent. And then there are the people, I read an article over at The Guardian recently, which is frankly a terrible publication, but regardless, there was an article there by someone who works in a funeral home, and she wrote about how she told a mother and father that they couldn't carry their son's coffin because she was enforcing some kind of COVID-related rule. And then she wrote further on about how it's normally a part of her job to offer a hug or a reassuring hand on the shoulder to support people when they are struggling to hold it together during a funeral service. And this is all now gone. She now keeps what she refers to as a social distance. In other words, she stands back more than 6 feet away while people are breaking down, and she tells them from that distance, no, you can't, touch your son's body. And there's just kind of, I don't know how to put into words the kind of immorality that I'm talking about with that, but to me, it's just kind of inconceivable.
Well, I've seen many videos, I'm sure you have too, Sarah, where people are verbally and even physically assaulted for either not keeping sufficient distance, people being shoved out of elevators, or not wearing masks and so on. And some analysts have said that what we're seeing is the emergence of kind of a new religion, what one commentator called the branch Covidians. And that the sign of your baptism, the sign of your circumcision, if you will, is the wearing of the mask, and that the great spiritual authorities are the county health commissioners. Is that too heavy an analysis? Is that overinterpreted?
No, I don't think so. Not when you see the kind of virulent reaction you get from some of these people who insist that there is science on their side while ignoring the science that disagrees with them. And it is absolutely a religious-like adherence that's, well, people have kind of come to accept. There's this thing where when people don't have faith, they yearn for it. I think this also is part of the human condition, that we seek something to kind of fill a void that we have there. And you see people who are atheist, and I mean that even if they've said that they're Christian before but never really thought that much about it. They just, heard that growing up, and so they just kind of regurgitate it like a trope almost. But those people, I think, still seek that kind of fulfillment. And as a result of that, they fill it with something like this whole mantra of follow the science, or they fill it with kind of government authoritarianism. And we're seeing that kind of manifest with a sort of fervor in which they embrace everything, each government person says, and will do anything, with no limitation. They'll tell a grieving mother and father of a 6-month-old boy, no, you can't carry his coffin. And, that is, well, inconceivable to me.
Sarah, since we're talking about the morality of the COVID lockdown, and we all agree it's been draconian, it's more than necessary, and it's having very terrible side effects, I want to pitch to you the idea that there may be a silver lining. When people ask me, Father, is COVID-19 a divine chastisement? I say, I don't think so, because God wouldn't let me off that easily. I do think it's a time for illumination. We're beginning to see that just underneath the skin of a lot of politicians are tyrants yearning to breathe free. And I think that just under the surface of the business of churchianity are hollow institutions, and what we've taken for granted in the education system on every level needs to be examined very carefully. And you caught my attention when you did a video on keeping secrets from parents, even as teachers are teaching kids through online media. Do you think people are starting to wake up and say, hey, we're in a mess and we need to do things differently? Have you seen any evidence of people thinking or speaking that way?
Yes, and I think it is probably the single biggest silver lining to this whole affair, is that so many parents are realizing that homeschooling isn't that hard. And, I think a lot of people are, or have been, afraid to take their children out of public school out of fear that they couldn't do it themselves, that they weren't equipped. And that really says something about the public schools if the public school didn't equip you to teach your own child. But regardless, I will say that there have been a lot of parents that have basically started experimenting with it, been forced to some degree, during this process, and they've realized that it's not actually that difficult to do. And as a result, I'm seeing a lot of different parents who have now decided, okay, that's it, we're going to homeschool from here out, we're going to do it our way. There are two reasons for that. That's firstly what I already mentioned, that it's not as difficult as you might think. And then secondly, the fact that they're realizing just how bad the public schools are, because they're getting access to what their kids are being taught, and they're not happy with it. And they should have never been happy with it, but they didn't even know because, the child was off at school. And I'll also tell you, what they're being taught whilst they're at home isn't as bad as what they were being taught when they were actually physically going to the schools, because we've seen these teachers online who have talked about how they're changing their classes to make them more palatable for parents, because they know that the parents will be listening and they don't want to have, discussions, political discussions while the parents are around, or discussions about homosexuality, or discussions about race. They don't want to basically try and indoctrinate the kids on these issues while the parents will be listening in. And so I think for multiple reasons, it's a good thing as long as it gets these kids out of public school and frankly gives them a decent education. I mean, I want
to point out my friend and colleague Matt Maloney brought to my attention a website called whataretheyllearning.com. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you can check out the based on your county, the curriculum of your school. And I just did some random checks, and for the most part, I found it absolutely alarming. And it seems things like reading, writing, and math are distant second, thirds, and fourth. And there's a whole lot of social engineering going on. And while the season of COVID tide has been painful, I'm glad that people are able to see firsthand what is being done with their children. So, you're a Christian. On your view, what are you learning about how church, broadly construed, has been conducted in the United States in light of the season of COVID tide?
Well, I think it's atrocious. Actually, I think it's shameful that so many churches actually shut down, even when told to. I think is their job to reject the authority of the state when the state says that that they're not essential. I think that's the time when the churches say, actually, yes, we are. And I think it's the church that should have expected things like these high rates of suicides and drug overdose, these deaths of despair, these deaths of loneliness. I think it's the church that should have expected all those things and spoken out. And I know that it's hard. I know that it's difficult to speak out when everyone around you is saying there's a plague coming and we have to, batten down the hatches and so on. I know that it's a difficult decision, but I also think that it's the job of the church to speak up exactly in those times when it is a difficult decision, when it's not easy to say, this is the right thing to do, we should, be Christian, our faith is important. I think it's at those times where it's the church that should be screaming from the rooftops, people need God. people need, it's kind of like a faith versus fear thing. And that's what the church should be speaking about, because you've got the very two opposites, I guess, more clearly demonstrated than any other instance that I can think of. Are you going to have faith, and are you going to, commute together and hold communion together even, or are you going to give in to this fear, and lots of people will die as a result of that fear?
Right. Right. No, there's a tremendous sorrow, and as a priest, it's been very painful for me for a while. I couldn't officiate a public sacraments at all, or we're doing masses out in the parking lot, or there are really extreme measures to take to anoint the sick, etc. And I think there are people who died alone, or people who died without the comfort of the sacraments of the gospel, and that's a loss that can scarcely be measured. And I also know in Christian history there are very great saints who responded to plagues that are more evidently plague-like than COVID-19 has been. So I find that very greatly concerning. Friends, we're talking with Sarah Corrier. She is an important new voice in alternative social media. She's known as the Crusader Gal. We're going to link to her websites in the show notes. We're talking about the morality of COVID-19 lockdowns. Sarah, I'm a professor of philosophy and theology. I take sign, symbol, and sacrament very, very seriously. And it seems to me that the cult of the mask, it worries me because it strikes me as intrinsically dehumanizing. What are your thoughts on that?
It is, absolutely. And it worries me because not only do you have this kind of dehumanization from person to person, you can't see another person's facial expression, you don't get that kind of impact, and I think this is one of the reasons that you have things like suicide rates going up, because people feel alone, because they don't, even when they go out, they don't really see people, they don't see compassion, and we do see these things in other people's faces. But it also bothers me because of children. I mean, what about the very young children who are growing up in this era, and they're not learning the very subtleties that we learned when we were children? We learned these facial expressions and what they mean, and we associate with them differently. And instead, now, you don't get that anymore.
Right. And I've not been comforted by seeing people buying masks for their kids with cute animal faces and so on. I think we are too readily accepting barriers. I know that when I'm preaching, I don't preach to the crowd, so to speak, but as an experienced speaker, I look for the non-verbal cues. How are people responding? Do I need to slow down? Do I need to pick up the pace? Am I dying? Am I succeeding? And all of that is taken away because there are people whose eyes, I can see maybe their eyes and nothing else. So that fundamentally concerns me as well, is the readiness of accepting these very dehumanizing measures. So Sarah, on your view, what are the lessons that we've learned? All right, we've been through COVID tide. Maybe people entered into it with good faith. I think that ran out rather quickly. What do you want people to remember? So in 2021 and maybe even 2030, what do you want people to tell each other about the year 2020?
That freedom is worth dying for. Honestly, that's the big thing. Because the truth is that throughout history, we've had people of real value, people that we revere today still, and should, who gave their lives fighting for freedom. And we say it so often that we don't listen to what we're saying. But honestly, they did. They died so that we could be free. Freedom is rather a new concept in human history. It's not the default state of things. And it has to be fought for, and people have to risk things to hold on to it. And what we have now is people giving in to fear and giving away their freedoms out of risk that maybe some people will die. And honestly, I think that even if that were the case, even if it was a plague, and it's not, but even if it were, I think that I would risk my life in order to maintain a free society for the next generation, that they don't have to live under the blight of communism, under the blight of tyranny. And that's what we're really setting up the next generation for, that they should just give away all their freedoms because somebody screams, it's an emergency. I don't think the founders of this country would have done that, and I certainly don't think they should have, and I'm glad that they didn't.
Right. What's the role of social media in generating a cult of fear?
Well, social media has become essentially propaganda, because it used to be just different people communicating freely in, rather short ways, but regardless, it was mass communication, that's all it was. But it's not anymore. Now it's big tech companies that are in many ways paid for by China, the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government, I'll add, is essentially determining what exactly we can say, how we should speak. And, I think that we end up in a situation where, people just can't even be honest with one another anymore because they're afraid that some big tech giant will come on. And frankly, the whole discussion has changed repeatedly. And it's changed because people like big tech and also the media have determined what exactly we can say. First it was, we just need to shut down to flatten the curve. Just, 14 days and everything will be fine. We have to prevent those hospitals from being overrun. Then it was, there's a ventilator shortage and, people are dying because of that, which is another reason why we need to stay shut down. Then it was, we need to protect the elderly, and this was the final one. And what's interesting about it is that the whole thing about the hospitals being overrun, well, it could be proven as false. The fact that we ran out of ventilators, that can be proven as false. We now know we did not run out of ventilators. Nobody in America died because of lack of access to a ventilator. But what you can't prove is that we're protecting the elderly. It's kind of like this vague term. And because of that, that's the settled mantra. That's where we're staying now. And yet you've got these big tech companies that keep suppressing medical information to try and keep this whole mantra going that if you don't do exactly what you're told by certain individuals in government, not by all of government because there's a lot of different contradictory data, but certain individuals that they want to listen to, places like the World Health Organization, which is run by China, by the way, and run by an ex-communist revolutionary, if you don't listen to them, then suddenly you're killing your grandmother. Because it's these kind of tropes that have no basis in reality that they want to keep people holding on to.
Sarah Curry, known as the Crusader Gal, thank you for being a very splendid guest. I hope we can have you on the show again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.